So the second pasuk of this Arami Ovid Avi section, the first pasuk described the descent. Arami Ovid Avi, Vayer Mitzrayma, Yaakov submitting to the fate of Jewish history, wandering through Israel, suffering the lack of sovereignty over the land of Israel. They lived in Israel, but they couldn't determine. The Galus had begun already when Yitzchak was born, casting the descent into Egypt and the start of that exile into the overall context of Jewish history, at least the way Yaakov saw it. The second pasuk clues us into the conspiracy and the intent, the strategy of the Egyptians. The pasuk reads, "Vayareu osanu hamitzrim." This is the pasuk from Kisavo, the second pasuk of Arami Ovid Avi. They persecuted us. Vayanunu, they tortured us. Vayitenu aleinu avodah kasha, they forced us into backbreaking labor. It's an interesting pasuk because it doesn't immediately or obviously describe anything sinister other than forcing us towards labor. There's a phrase, vayanunu, they tortured us. Inoi, they caused us deprivation or suffering. But the pasuk in general, independent of any one particular component, is suggestive of a process. Vayareu, vayanunu, vayitnu aleinu avodah kasha. And this is based on a Gemara in Sota on Daf Yud Aleph. The Gemara interprets the word perach, that the Egyptians, the pasuk in Shemos, Vayavidu Mitzrayim es b'nei Yisrael beferach. So ferach comes from the term backbreaking labor, hard labor. There's actually a prohibition of lo tirdenu befarach, that you're not allowed to submit a slave. If you own a slave, if you own a Jewish slave, you're not allowed to submit him to excessive hard labor. So the term perach refers to the hard labor which the Egyptians imposed upon the Jews. But the Gemara in Sota suggests that the word perach comes from something else. It's a conjugation of the word perach, a soft voice. That the Egyptians did not immediately impose this tyranny, this murder. It wasn't an immediate, quick process. It was a slow, staged evolution. Various midrashim, various gemaras, where the Egyptians first encourage all Egyptian citizens to work on behalf of the effort, the war effort, the infrastructure effort. Some say that they placed some sort of symbolic stone around Paro's neck or other people's neck, that we're all working on behalf of the Egyptian glory, of Egyptian culture, of Egyptian supremacy, to build these towering pyramids to demonstrate Egyptian prowess. And slowly but surely, the workload was incremented, and the Jews were villainized, and what had started as defaming Jews, what had started as accusing Jews, hava nischak malo. In fact, the Haggadah cites that pasuk in the beginning of Shemos, vayareu osanu. In Parshas Chukas, the phrase vayareu lanu appears, where the Egyptians afflicted us, persecuted us, imposed suffering upon us. But the pasuk which the Haggadah quotes to interpret the phrase vayareu osanu, the pasuk in Kisavo is not vayareu lanu, but vayareu osanu. They didn't torture us initially. First, they villainized us. And the pasuk which the Haggadah quotes is the pasuk from the beginning of Shemos, hava nischak malo. Let's strategize. Let's find some solution to the Jewish problem. And in order to preach their virulent hate and genocidal plans to their average countrymen, who presumably had a basic sense of morality and virtue, they had to first cast the Jews as a threat, as a peril, as a villain, as a devil, literally as a fifth column. These Jews are multiplying too rapidly. They will ally themselves with our enemies ultimately, and subvert or sabotage the Egyptian effort. Not vayareu lanu, vayareu osanu. We weren't the victims initially of their persecution. We were merely the subjects of their defamation. We were merely the subjects of their caricatures, of their discrimination, of their anti-Semitism. And it's chillingly reminiscent of what happened in Nazi Germany. In order to preach, in order to validate their genocide, the Jews had to be cast as a sub-Aryan race. In order to validate the murder of Jews, the Jews had to be cast as killers of Jesus. In order to validate the murder of Jews, so Ahmadinejad has to claim that we're an imperialist, colonialist society that's just committing all sorts of war crimes. I mean, laughable war crimes in Gaza. The amount of care we took and the amount of peril and danger that we absorbed as an army, while other armies just simply carpetbag entire streets in order to kill terrorists who are hiding behind civilians or using hospitals and mosques and smuggling arms and ambulances. But this is a story that repeats itself throughout history. It's a cyclical story where Jews are defamed, and that defamation of Jews, which seems so either innocent or inconsequential, irrelevant, sows the seeds, creates fertile ground for ultimate murder of Jews. And this is precisely what happened in Mitzrayim. And it wasn't an immediate hard labor. It was first convincing the population that the Jews were indeed dangerous. They could sabotage, they could subvert Egyptian interests. And after the Egyptians bought that propaganda, then the Jews were included in some sort of national works, national effort to build the pride of Egypt, and slowly but surely, gradually, what had started off as a combination of defamation and playing on the suspicion of Jews dual loyalty. Well, you have to be loyal to Egypt, so you have to submit yourself to the Egyptian infrastructure. Vayareu osanu, vaya'anunu, vayitnu aleinu avodah kasha. Finally, it ends up being backbreaking labor, torture, persecution, murdering young babies, flinging their dead corpses into the bricks. And sometimes we're not attentive enough to the first signs of anti-Semitism. We're not attentive enough. We let ourselves be hypnotized, or we slip into a stupor. We don't realize the pathology, the developmental nature of anti-Semitism. The same Gemara talks about maror as being an herb. We show him talk about the maror as being an herb that initially is sweet, or at least isn't as bitter and as distasteful as it ultimately becomes. Chilaso rach v'sofo kasha. Initially, maror may even be sweet, or if it isn't sweet, it isn't as distasteful. But ultimately emerges into something very, very difficult to swallow, very difficult to, very bitter. So this is an interesting pasuk, both in its particular components. Vayareu osanu, they cast us as villains. Vaya'anunu, they tortured us. Again, anunu doesn't suggest hard work, discrimination, laws, defamation. Vayitnu aleinu avodah kasha. Also light verbs. They didn't kill us. There's nothing in this pasuk that suggests the murder, the tyranny, the slavery, the avodah kasha, the perach, that perhaps Egyptians initially joined in. It's a pasuk that seems almost innocent, but dangerous in its innocence. It's slow, it's gradual, but you have to nip it in the bud, and you have to tell the initial signs, and sometimes we miss those signs. So this is the second pasuk of Arami Ovid Avi, and ironically it doesn't describe a full-blown slavery or servitude, but the stages, the preliminary moments leading up to the enslavement. Ultimately, the enslavement we'll read about in future psukim that we dive into, Amaleinu, Lachasenu. Ultimately, the discrimination and the defamation did lead to persecution, to genocide.